In this video, I'm going to talk about how I animated a transitional montage in my short film Float Away. Although this isn't a tutorial, I will link to any videos that help me, as well as any other ones that are relevant to what I'm talking about in the description, as well as in the card links. This will be fairly in-depth, but I'm not going to explain everything that I did, rather focusing on why I did it, and how I tried to use what could have been a throwaway scene transition to add to the story of the film, giving character details and emphasising the themes of the film. In a video recently I showed a time-lapse of the modelling and texturing of the girl character in the sequence, but I didn't talk about why I chose that design at all. The concept of this girl was to be a cross between a hippie and steampunk, the idea being that she grew up in a dump and uses the things around her that have been discarded to create things. This is in her costume design in particular, with asymmetry being a core design concept, as well as adding small details such as a bottle cap earring and a single yellow crock to show her resourcefulness. This then translated into her method of transport. I originally had the idea of her riding a tricycle, but then happened upon recumbent bikes, which are like reverse tricycles, and thought they looked more interesting. Then, when I was designing the bike, I decided to use a technique called kit bashing, which is where you use bits and pieces of other models to create a mismatched new model. In this case, I took bits of other models of bikes, tyres and a gaming chair to create the bike, and then tied it all together with some sticks. This gave the bike a DIY look that adds to the girl's character, and also plays into one of the key themes of the film, which is finding beauty in damaged and discarded things. I also wanted the bike to fly, so I made the frame with sticks and modelled the wings. I then added an armature to the sections that I would want to animate, and used a driver to automatically make the wheels spin when the bike moved. With the main assets created, I began the first shot. I'd already found the song that I wanted to use for this sequence, a cover of House of the Rising Sun, so I brought the section that I wanted into DaVinci Resolve, and then marked out the key beats of the song so that I could place certain moments in the right times to match the music. Then on to animation. To make the bike move, I used a generator modifier on the main bike control empty to make it go forward at a steady rate. I then began working on the camera move so that I wouldn't have to animate anything not being seen. I had this idea of a tracking shot that pulls out of a close-up of the balloon and into a wide to show the vehicle in full. I soon decided to change this to a zoom out, however, to make it a more realistic camera move. A zoom would allow me to emphasise the speed of the movement, with trees whooshing past the camera. I added some noise modifiers to the rotation and location of the camera, as well as using the camera shakeify add-on to create some fairly realistic camera motion while still keeping the balloon in frame. I then moved on to texturing the ground, and I want to put a quick side note in here. You may notice that I don't work in a particularly conventional or linear way when creating a shot. This is mostly because I want to be excited about the thing that I'm working on, so I just work on whatever part of the shot I feel like doing at the time, rather than following a specific workflow. I find that it keeps me more creative, but I understand that it's not always recommended. Anyway, I use a ground texture from a HDRI haven for the floor and transition it into a dirt texture. This is to show the move away from civilization. It's a small touch but just about noticeable in the final shot. I do this using two gradient maps and a noise texture to mix the shaders together. I then bring in a HDRI to do some lighting and work as a background. Continuing with the background, I use the ANT landscape add-on to generate mountains for the background, and use geometry nodes to spread paint strokes across them to give them a painterly feel. I used the object info and colour ramp node to randomise the colour of the strokes, and then used the random value geometry node to randomise size and rotation. I then began playing with the foreground objects to show the speed of the bike, as well as a storytelling device to show the transition to nature. With this in mind, I ended up beginning the shot with painted concrete buildings behind the bike, which then slowly transitioned into trees in the foreground and midground. I then needed to think of a way to transition into the next shot, so I used a particle system to have falling leaves blow in front of the camera that could wipe in front of the lens and work as a transition. The second shot is very similar to the first, and I could have made it a single shot, but the leaf wiping across the lens allowed me to split it into two shots, which meant that I could delete anything from the first shot that isn't needed for the second, such as the mountains and the buildings. This kept my project running smoothly. For the second shot I wanted to focus on the action of the girl turning the mechanism to open the wings, but I also wanted to keep the energy high. I went back to my music to see when the action of turning of the stick should occur to line up with the song. There happened to be a higher note on the guitar played at about the right time, so I made note of what frame that note began on, and had my character start to turn her hand at that frame. To emphasise the movement, I added a zoom and rotation of the camera. I also added a small character detail of how she grips the stick with one finger at a time, but it's unfortunately lost in the motion blur and leaves in the final shot. Moving on to the third shot, I thought a top-down angle would be best to reveal the wings for the first time. I began with a simple animation of the wings unfurling, slightly offsetting the animation to make it more realistic, as well as to hide the keyframes. I then went in and played with the movement curves of each bone to add character to how they open, having them get stuck momentarily and bump into each other. This made the shot more interesting, but also added to the character, as the mechanism doesn't work perfectly. It shows that it's probably something she made herself. It's also important to the plot that the wings don't work how she wants them to, so this foreshadows that information slightly. I wanted the wings to flap in the wind, which I initially tried to simulate with the cloth modifier and wind force, but soon found that making it appear exactly how I wanted wasn't going to happen, so I therefore came up with a solution of using a wave modifier with a displace modifier instancing from a noise texture to add variation to the flaps. This gave the wings the impression of flapping in the wind without any simulations. I could also easily control how fast and how violently they would flap. Having watched a video essay earlier in the day that referenced the way the cover of trees affects the light on the ground, I had decided to add some texture to the light to make the shot more visually interesting. So I made the light colour node based and added a few textures with some basic seething animation. I adjusted the size and intensity until it looked good and made sure that it transitioned into my other lighting well. I then used a similar geometry node tree that I used for the mountains to create the painterly ground on either side of the path. With that rendered, I went back and ran a smoke simulation on the wings when they opened to have dust come off of them, adding more visual interest as well as emphasising the grime of the location and vehicle. Moving on to the final shot that I'm going to talk about, although there are 2 more shots in the sequence, but they deserve their own video as they're more complicated. I wanted to achieve 2 things in this shot. Firstly, I wanted to transition to sunset as I designed the following shot to be a golden hour, and I also needed to show the wings in action. I began, again, with looking when my music had a cue that I could use. Unfortunately enough, there was a beat at around the right time, so I could have my character strike a pose in front of the sun. So in Blender, I subdivided and extruded a plane and used the Disperse modifier with a noise texture to create mountains. I then used the array modifier to make more going back and used the displace modifier again, this time with a gradient texture to make them get higher as they got further away. In retrospect, I could have just used a single plane with an array modifier, which would have been more simple, but this worked as well. I then used the solidify and subdivide modifiers to add depth and geometry. Then in the shading tab, I used a gradient node to change the colour as they got further away, and a noise texture to add variation to the colour of each mountain. I then modelled and textured my foreground mountains and used a sky texture to add a sun that I could control and that would affect the lighting depending on its location. Once I was happy with the camera angle and position, I animated the sun to drop from the sky and roll between the mountains, landing in place in time with the music. This was an idea that I had in the moment when I was trying to find a good position for the sun in the shot, and decided to add it to the shot as it solved my issue of creatively transitioning to sunset. I then used a curve to guide the motion of the bike and animated along the curve, with it slowing down in front of the sun to hit a pose on beat. I then had it shoot away quickly, as I knew that for the next shot I would have to be travelling faster. I went in and animated the girl on the bike, so she pushes herself off of the hill, leans forward and absorbs the landing. I did the same with the wings. I then added some extra lighting between the mountains to give the shot more depth and rendered it. In compositing, I have a general node tree that adds glow, grain, line work to the shadows and some lens distortion and blur at the edges. I then go into each individual shot and change specific things to get it just right. For the first 3 shots, that mostly consisted of bumping the colours up and adding a little extra blur around the edges. For the last shot, however, I also added some lens dirt, for which I used a free image of lens dirt and bokeh on a black background. I then used the lens reflection and glow node with just the glow visible, rather than the base image as well. I combined these with a screen blending mode and then merged them with the lens dirt image with a multiply blending mode. I then layered this on top of my image sequence with a screen blending mode. This dirtied up my otherwise very clean image. For the base image sequence, I also used a tilt shift blur node to give it that miniature toy look. Finally, for the sound design, I added lots of whooshes and smaller sounds that add texture to the audio rather than drawing too much attention to themselves individually. But I also used larger, more exaggerated sounds, such as a bowling strike sound when she hits the pose in front of the sun. To demonstrate this, I'm going to play the sequence without any music. As you can see, the music adds a lot to the scene, but the additional sound design is also very important. Here it is with just the music and no additional sound effects. it sounds much emptier without the sound effects. For this project I have 45 audio tracks. There are parts of the film where all the tracks are being used at the same time, meaning that you're hearing 45 individual sounds at some points in the film. In this sequence, the maximum you hear is about 20 tracks, which is when the wings are opening. Hopefully this gave you a fairly good idea of how I animated this sequence. I didn't want to get into too much technical detail, but also give an idea of the process when it comes to animating a scene like this. Thanks for watching.